Hey everyone, welcome back to Cross and Crown University. Today we're going to dive into a heavy but incredibly important topic: how Christians respond to the accusation that the Bible commands genocide. I recently watched Cliffe and Stuart's video, The Bible Commands Genocide, and I've got some thoughts to share. Let's watch this video together, and I'd love to hear what you think after watching this. Take a look.
Do you think that this grace, this omnipotence, this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children and even the animals, at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out. And if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed. And then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully. First point, do I allow God to judge? In my culture, that's unacceptable. And yet the Bible insists God does have the right to judge. Second point, is exaggeration being used? Is hyperbole being used in a lot of those passages? Yes, it is. Because clearly, obviously, many of those people who were supposedly all wiped out appear in the next book. So you know that they weren't all wiped out. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, you look at the archaeological evidence for Jericho and Ai, and you begin to realize those were probably smaller fortresses. Yes, Rahab was in there as a prostitute, but those were not just families and women and children. Those were fortresses that were protecting the families that lived out in the countryside around them. Next point is, I think that there is not the emphasis on individualism in the Old Testament that we have in our culture.
Yep.
And yet, the more we struggle through children of alcoholics and realize that there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations. And I think the Old Testament does present a picture that we are more interconnected than we as American individualists would like to admit. And when God judges a people group, yes, some innocent people are swept along in the judgment. And that bugs me. I don't like that. And yet, that is part of, I think, what the Bible is talking about when it says we're created in the image of God, meaning that we do have free will, which means there are consequences to my decisions that affect my children, that affect my grandchildren. We're more interconnected than we would like to admit. So no, those children are not being punished for anything they did wrong, but yes, they're born into a cursed, messed up world, and there are consequences to that. I mean, I benefited from going to Davidson College, and a lot of people sacrificed to put Davidson together. You benefited from going to Oxford University, and there are a lot of people who have over many years given sacrificially to build that. So there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations of our decisions. And also, the Bible never says that those children and all those people go to eternity separate from God. I'm convinced that we will see those children in heaven if they were killed before an age of accountability. So the justice of God will ultimately triumph.
Yeah.
But do I have problems with the text? Yes, of course I have problems with the text. I don't understand it exactly. I don't understand what God is doing exactly there, why he says that kind of thing. But I'm also convinced that hyperbole is being used. And I think that's a very important thing. For instance, when I was in high school, we used to say, we're going to kill the opposing team that we're going to play that weekend. Not meaning we're literally going to kill them. And the whole idea of, in the Hebrew herem, H-E-R-E-M, of clearing out these people from the promised land. The whole idea that God had given them over 400 years to repent, and they had chosen not to, and now God clears them out. You know, I think it's a complex issue, more complex than the person who would allow it to be, who just says, I just can't believe that God would do something like that.
Like, what kind of instruction had these people been given? You know, like the people of Ai, the people of Jericho, the Canaanites. I mean, did they have Jewish prophets coming to them and saying, you should repent of your ways? Or were they just sort of expected to work it out on their own?
Fascinating question. I'm not sure. I do not know. Obviously, they have consciences. We all have consciences.
Yeah.
And when you study ethics from around the world, it's amazing that it seems we're all like reading off the same sheet music.
Yeah.
And there's
tremendous
more and
agreement.
more research coming out too on just how bad these people groups really
Sure,
work.
right.
I'm seeing more of this.
Child sacrifice.
Canaanites, yeah, exactly. It just gets
Yeah,
worse
yeah,
every
yeah,
year.
right.
Like how bad is it going to get? And so, but the second one, have you wrestled with this being a really culturally conditioned question?
Oh, absolutely,
Issue of
yeah.
yours? 'Cause the Chinese don't struggle with this one.
Yeah.
When I've talked to people of other cultures and I brought it up and been like, that's totally fine that God judges in that kind of way.
It's so much worse because it's not just like culturally relative. Like I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't believe in the existence of objective moral values, right?
Yeah.
And so like, what could I possibly be meaning here? But I don't wrestle with it because my job here isn't to say that this is wrong. My job is to say something like what Lincoln said of slavery. If this isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. If there is such a thing as objective morality, I find it very. I mean, look, we just condemned the Canaanites in part for they were killing children. Well, that's exactly what God ordered the Israelites to do when they came into their nation. And we say, okay, well, these people were sinful, idolatrous, and they should have repented. Well, the same is true of the Israelites. They were sinful, they were idolatrous. And yet they had the benefit of having the prophet of God come to them with literal stone tablets telling them what to do. And even then it took them a few tries to get right. The Canaanites didn't have that. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, they get a prophet who comes and sets them straight. When the Canaanites are sinful, they get obliterated. They get exterminated. They get chased out.
Just the same way the Israelites were at first the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
True, but it was wrong for the Assyrians to do that. It was wrong for the Babylonians to do that.
Yeah, but the Old Testament insists that was part of God's judgment on the Israelites for them doing the child sacrifice, temple prostitution, idolatry. God, so it's God. It gets back to, does God have the right to judge? Yes, he judged the Canaanites, but then remember, a few hundred years later, he judged the Jews, first at the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
So I wanted to talk about the hyperbole thing, right? Because maybe we're not talking about killing everybody, maybe...
Well, obviously not, because they were occurring in the next book.
But okay, so for example, in the destruction of Ai, 12,000 people fell that day, all the people of Ai. That's what's said in the book of Joshua. Now, maybe all the people of Ai is like an exaggeration, but 12,000 people is pretty specific. It'd be a weird thing to be doing as hyperbole, right? We have a number of people, 12,000 people. We know it's men, we know it's women, we know it's children are slaughtered. We know that that's not hyperbole. We know that thousands of men were killed. We know that I should quote, I don't want to get this wrong. Perhaps we should look at the text. Yeah, so in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all of the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all of the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 people fell that day. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. So we know that women are being killed, non-combatants are being killed. We know that there are thousands of them. We also know that there were people who had left. They'd run into the wilderness. They were out of the promised land, but the Israelites chased after them and then killed them in the wilderness. And it says all of them were put to the sword. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe that some of them ran away. Maybe all of the ones that they captured were put to the sword, but some of them managed to actually run away, and those are the people who show up in the next chapter. But it's only because, for want of trying, that they managed to survive. But maybe it is just hyperbole. But we know that 12,000 people were killed. We know that the Israelites then turned around after killing the fleeing combatants, came back into the city and killed who's left. Well, who's left? The women, the children, the disabled. So even if there's some hyperbole being involved here in terms of the complete destruction, maybe it's not a genocide, but it certainly still seems to be the kind of military practice which, if done today, would see condemnation and a lot more from the United Nations. In 1 Samuel, there's this. Again, I should read the text to be sure, and I do have it written down. This is the destruction of the Amalekites. God issues the command now, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to the death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Of course, this can't be literal, because it's not just the camels and sheep and the donkeys. Oh, but you can leave the pigs or whatever. Sure, this is sort of like slightly rhetorical language, but it's very clear, like, leave alive nothing that breathes. Kill the men, kill the women, kill the animals, kill the cattle. And in fact, when Saul decides at the end of the battle to keep alive the king, take him as a hostage, and also keeps alive some of the animals to sacrifice, to slaughter as a sacrifice to God, what happens? He's condemned. And God says, the scripture says, that God regretted that he made Saul king. He regretted that he made Saul king because he didn't follow his command. What command didn't he follow? That after wiping out the Amalekites, he refused to also kill all of the animals, and he kept the king alive as a hostage. And that was enough for God to say, I regret that I ever made Saul king because he didn't follow my commands. And so I understand that there may be some hyperbole involved here, but in the case where Saul is punished, specifically not for killing all of the animals, it's hard for me to imagine like how much scope there is for hyperbole here in terms of undermining the criticism that we are talking about the slaughter of innocent people here.
Mm-hmm. It shows the importance and just how clear God wants to make it that Israelites are to be set apart and a holy people. And so whether it's an ant or a soldier all the way down, we see with sinful human beings just how easy it is for them to slip into prostitution, but more so getting a harem, more so whatever this might be, and slip into assimilation of some sort with other civilizations. And so God has to act in this kind of way, however extreme it seems, to show them, whether it's Achan later on in Acts chapter 5, for example, the temptation and how quick this happens. It's such a slippery slope where God is saying, here's the line, and we have to do away with any level of temptation. You talked about temptation earlier. We know how easy is it to fall prey to temptation. This is another thing with university students and older people. All they want to talk about is temptation and how easy it is to fall typically into like porn addiction and these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Well, very similar to what's going on there in terms of you have to kill off any and everything that's going to cause temptation because you are God's holy chosen people. Okay, well, whoa, isn't that really ethnocentric? Isn't that a big issue still? I don't see that in my mind because I believe what's going on in the Old Testament with the Israelite people is probably the most exclusive inclusivity you could ever imagine, which is God is this God of the Israelites who are holy people who are not supposed to mix at all, even with an animal, with people of another civilization. So that's how exclusive they are, but how inclusive in the sense of they're a light to all the nations. And eventually it's going to come through the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who is literally Samaritan, child, woman, all the oppressed people groups, and Zacchaeus, like we talked about earlier, Luke chapter 19, and the sycamore tree, who a tax collector, probably very wealthy. So it's a light to all nations, and that separateness, that word holy and righteousness, he takes so seriously and so extreme. I wish it wasn't that extreme, but it stacks up to me. It also makes sense seeing how powerful human temptation really is and how hard it is to restrain yourself.
Do you believe that, to be clear, do you believe that innocent children were killed by Israelites on the command of God? I think it's a historical fact.
I believe that innocent children were killed by Israeli bombs, and they happen to be Palestinians, part of Hamas maybe, or Hezbollah. I believe that there are consequences to human decisions that stretch down through the generations and that impact a lot of innocent people. And I think we're a little naive if we think that we can go into Iraq or fight a desert storm and no innocent people are going to be killed. It's one of the tragedies of war, which is a result of the sinful human heart.
But suppose, the Israeli government said, leave alive nothing that breathes. Kill the soldiers, but then once you've done that, turn around, go back, kill the women, kill the children, kill their animals. Because this land is yours. I think that people wouldn't be satisfied on falling back on the defense of, hey, this is the consequence of war. This is what happens. I think people would say, okay, but the fundamental rule of just war, which I'm told is sort of stems out of the Christian tradition, is, proportionate response. And
yes. And I agree with you. Okay, but here's another problem. God told Abraham to take Isaac up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice his son. Now, if someone interprets that as being God's laying down wise principles for good parenting, they're an idiot.
Sure, yeah.
That is not what Genesis chapter 2 is communicating. God gave Abraham a very specific command, and it was not to give an example of wise parenting. It was, Abraham, who's number one in your heart? Is it going to be God or is it going to be your son? Who are you going to build your future on? Your son or me? Similarly, what Israel does there in the Old Testament is not examples of just war theory. No, it is a unique example of God using a theocracy, and we don't live in a theocracy. We don't have a theocracy in Israel now, and we're definitely not a theocracy in the United States or in UK. God using a theocracy to carve out a land that he brings then Messiah into. That's a one-time deed, because you're absolutely right. It is not an example of just war. No way. I recoil at that as you do, I'm sure.
Yeah, because of course the difference in this case is that you have the orders from the top man. It's sort of, if there is some extraordinary circumstance in which this kind of otherwise morally condemnable behavior can be justified, you better have the authority to know that you're making the right decision. And in this case, the Christian will be able to say that they did have that authority. But I mean, it's a struggle.
Yes, it is.
We're talking about the intentional killing of non-combatant children here. And I read this text as a land dispute. I read in Deuteronomy where God gives instructions when you march up onto a city to attack it, like in the broad sense. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. Some peace. If they refuse to make peace and engage you in battle, which isn't entirely unreasonable given what the terms of peace are, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. Women and children being described as plunder that can be used because God has given them to you as plunder. But of course, those are the people who you're attacking not because they're in the promised land. And it's just, look, we gave them a chance to leave. What are we supposed to do? This is God's chosen. No, these are other cities. Because it goes on, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and lists, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all detestable things that they do in worshipping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So clearly what you're saying about them being these detestable characters and God is issuing his judgment must be true here, because it's saying otherwise, if you don't destroy them completely, they will teach you their ways, you will fall into sin. But this idea of, marching up to a city, and even if they accept you, they're going to become, your indentured servants. And if they don't, then you may take the women and children as plunder, and you may use the plunder the Lord gives you. But of course, if you're marching into a city of one of the nations that you've been promised by God, then don't leave alive anything that breathes. Kill all of the children, kill all of the women. I mean, it's the difference there, in other words, about the people in the inherited lands and the people outside of it, tells me that the explanation for why these people need to be completely and utterly destroyed is because this is our land. We want this land. Seems to be, and when I read about somebody intentionally driving out or killing nations of people so that they can sort of essentially ethnically cleanse a land, I don't know what else to call that other than a genocide.
But it's still eventually, the point is to welcome them in. And it's not like they're going to sit in the land flowing with milk and honey forever. And again, be God's chosen people. And that's it. So that's one. Secondly, we're reading this again from our 21st century Judeo-Christian lens. So your outrage and indignation over this is entirely Christian. That's why the Bible is self-critiquing, which I love about it. Thirdly, putting to the sword, even women and children, as messed up as that sounds, many would say that was actually more gracious in that time period than other civilizations who they're going to get raped the rest of their lives, right? And just horrific things that are unimaginable to us. So that's another really important thing to remember. And then lastly, the one you got to wrestle with is, okay, so in an ancient Near Eastern culture, you're looking for God to act in a very humane kind of way. All right, to what extent? And what extent does free will come into play as well? Not just the evil heart of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
But how exactly do you want to play God? Because I want to play God too in those passages. But what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
What specifically does that look like?
Wow, what a deep dive. Cliffe and Stuart brought some valuable context and thought-provoking points to the table, but this is a conversation that doesn't end here. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what stood out to you. Do you agree with their interpretation, or do you have a different perspective? Let's keep the discussion going in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this reaction and want to see more videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep asking the big questions and seeking truth. We'll see you next time.